y'all. Andrew here with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans. It's a dark and stormy night in the French Quarter, and we are gonna, at long last, give you a ghost tour around the neighborhood. This has been coming for a while, but we've needed to get the right expert help on hand to make it happen, and into that public service has stepped my colleague Sandy. Hi, Sandy.
Hi.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
This is a thing the people have been clamoring for, and ghost tours exist in a ton of cities. It's a thing you do all over the world, but in New Orleans in particular, it's one of the things that you do. You've been doing this for a while. Why do you feel like people come here wanting this? Is it death? Is it ghosts? What are they after? Why?
I think a lot of it has to do with people not understanding the religion of voodoo. And because Hollywood has made that religion so frightening and sinister, that by proxy, New Orleans has become frightening and sinister. And so people arrive here expecting that the whole city is haunted, the whole city, something's lurking behind the corner, sort of that mentality associated with it.
Yeah, we see some of that in American Horror Story Covent, which is one of the reasons why people come looking for these things sometimes. And we also have whole other videos devoted to voodoo, which you can learn more about that subject and what it's really like and why it is not massively sinister. Do you feel like there are better reasons why one might associate these stories with here?
Yeah, I think so. I think New Orleans really was the colony that shouldn't have happened. It's in an impossible place.
Yeah.
And so you sort of are always on the edge, real close to the bone when you live in New Orleans. Destruction is just lurking around the corner, and it's why I think we're allowed to drink in the streets, because you just never know when it's all gonna go to hell.
You've been giving ghost tours for some years, other tours as well, of course, and you've met a lot of the people who do show up for them. What do you find they come here looking for? What are people expecting?
They want to see a ghost, and they want that quintessential haunted house experience.
Yeah.
They want the controlled fear.
Very well phrased. Yeah, if you go on ghost tours some other places, there are cities where the norm, or where at least sometimes you might be handed something that's supposed to beep at you when a ghost is nearby. That's not a thing you see so much in New Orleans. And there are cities where the norm is to have more of a sort of amusement park, immersive haunted house style vibe, and that's not really a thing we do here either. It tends to be a straight storytelling experience in New Orleans, for better or for worse, and that's what we're gonna provide this evening. I also should say, people wanting to see a ghost, who knows what'll happen during our time together, but we promise
perhaps
no
we'll
special
conjure
effects.
something up.
That's right. It'll be by pure accident and pure nature if it does happen. Well, if y'all were to ever come on a ghost tour with us, with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans, you would be meeting right at this site. So we're by St. Louis Cathedral in Jackson Square, and this is where those tours would meet, generally in the evening time. Get the mood just right. And as y'all may know, the tour company that we both work with, Free Tours by Foot New Orleans, the free in the name there, gives you a little hint how we work. The tours we do are all pay what you will, and so you get to pay whatever you feel like the tour was worth after you've gotten the experience and gotten to appraise it. Sandy and I both work on that model, and so if y'all enjoy what you experience this evening, you would find down in the information below Sandy's tip information, so you can act like you were really here in person, taking a real tour with a real guide and paying real money for it. So if that appeals to you, you'll find the way to do it down there. We're going to start with a story that's right here in Jackson Square, just a few steps away. You ready to go over and hit up
Let's do it.
Muriel's?
Absolutely.
All right, off we go. Y'all, we step just outside of Jackson Square. The sun has set completely. Sandy has taken off her sunglasses because it's so hard to see. And we are by Muriel's Jackson Square. This is one of the restaurants right around the square where you can get a pretty classic Creole meal, albeit in a fairly new restaurant, but wasn't always a restaurant. Sandy, you want to share some of the prehistory of this place with us?
Yeah, absolutely. At one point in time, this was a house that belonged to a man by the name of Pierre Lepardie Jourdain. And Pierre Lepardie Jourdain was a very wealthy businessman here in the city of New Orleans. And so he had kind of worked intimately with an architect, designed this home to make it as accommodating as he could for himself, his wife, and their two children. And he kind of spared no expense in decorating the interior of the building, and he liked to show it off. And it didn't really matter, if it was like your first time to one of his parties or your fifth time. He always gave you the grand tour to point out the expensive things that he had in his house that sadly you couldn't afford to have in your own house. But unbeknownst to his wife and children, as the years passed, he got himself into a little trouble. He got a little bit of a gambling problem. And what I mean by that is that he sucked at it. And slowly but surely, he just worked his way through the family fortune. And this culminated one evening when, in a fit of hubris, he decided to bet his home in a card game. So he bets his home in a card game, and honest to God, if you're going to bet your house in a card game, you ought to cheat. And he didn't. So he lost his home.
Deserved it.
Yeah, he totally lost his home. And then he knew he was going to have to go back and explain to his wife and children that the house they'd come to know and love, they were to be evicted from in 3 days' time. But, it's also going to start spreading around the gossip that he's lost his house due to his hubris. And so he goes upstairs and into his own private study that night, and he hanged himself. So just going to, leave it all to his wife and children to clean up the mess, and they're going to be evicted with nobody to take care of them back in that time period when he would have been the only breadwinner. So, that's what used to be here long before Muriel's.
And I assume, since this is ghost tour material, remnants of that story are still hanging around?
Absolutely. So when Muriel's took over the restaurant, they began noticing some strange occurrences.
Haunted restaurant, y'all. This is very French Quarter.
Yeah. So they would see, like, the wait staff complained of seeing a shadowy figure walk across the room to disappear through one of the walls. Later, they began to smell phantom pipe smoke. I say phantom, this is a restaurant that's a non-smoking restaurant. They would try to seek out the source of that smoke and could never identify it. Still later, he began escalating things. He would take glasses, kind of toss them across the room to smash on the opposite wall. Still later, he took expensive bottles of wine, threw them across the room to smash on the opposite wall.
Real tragedy.
Right. The wait staff complained that sometimes when they were carrying large plates of food, that they'd feel as though someone shoved them or like tripped them, and the food would often end up on the floor. I think that was an excuse for them nipping at the wine cellar. Because what a great excuse. Like, I'm not drunk. Les parties Jordan, trip me.
Advantages of being in a haunted building, for sure.
So
it
good
sounds
times.
like ups and downs around this. Did they let this lie?
No. So what Muriel's decided to do was to consult kind of a psychic or a medium. And that psychic came in, went upstairs and into the room that he took his own life in, and she held a seance. And when she came downstairs, she told them that, they've misunderstood. This isn't their restaurant, it's still his home. And because it is a restaurant, it looks like they're throwing lavish parties in the home of a man who loved to throw lavish parties. And they're not somehow making him the guest of honor. And she suggested that they do something to placate him. And that's what Muriel's has started to do. So every night they dress a table in linen, and on that table they leave out a plate of bread and 2 glasses of wine. And I'm told that since they've started doing this, that the activity has calmed down considerably, unless of course somebody forgets to change out that table anew, and then he pitches an unholy fit and they usually get canned.
And he gets a +1.
Yes.
Dang.
Yeah.
All right. Free forever, y'all.
You can also, I'm told, dine at his table. And they try to leave like one empty chair for him when you do dine at the table. And every once in a while, if you ask nicely, he'll pose for a photograph.
So this is one with kind of, in spite of a sad story behind it, some pretty fun ghosts in the present. Like, this is the kind of place where you might want to see some things. And lots of people do come here, so it's a high traffic spot. The next place we're going to show y'all is going to be a little further from the beaten path, but it's going to be the most visited place on these tours, hands down, and one of the best known stories that has in many forms made it outside of New Orleans. So we're going to head next thing to the Lollarie Mansion. Here we go. So y'all, we've arrived at the Lollarie Mansion under a full moon with countless constellations above us. And This, if anybody has heard of one of these stories before, like this is probably the one.
I mean, anybody who's seen American Horror Stories Coven is familiar with this particular house. If
Kathy Bates' rendition of
absolutely,
this character.
Yes, absolutely. Or if you know anything about Nicolas Cage, you know that at one point in time he owned the house as well. And it featured in Ozzy Osbourne's show with his son, Jack, Ozzy and Jack, which is on Netflix, and they spend the night in this particular house to see if they feel any of the spirits that are supposed to be in the house.
Which is like the only way to get inside is to get like special access, because this is still a home, or it's a home again.
Right.
It's been a lot of things in between. As far as spirits that are supposed to be in the house, like what's the stuff that people hear about happening here, but what people see here, etc.?
Obviously, the ghost of the original owner is supposed to still be inhabiting the place, which was Delphine LaLaurie, as well as the enslaved Africans that she had on this particular piece of property and that she was abusing on this particular piece of property are still haunting the place as well.
So we're getting towards the meat of the story there. Do you want to share who she is?
So Delphine LaLaurie, she was born Delphine McCarty. So she was born into a locally wealthy and politically connected family. This is not the house. So the original house is going to burn almost all the way to the ground. And their house really would not have been this 3-story situation. It would have only been 2 stories, similar to the buildings that we're surrounded by.
And it's worth pointing out, y'all, for those of you who did see American Horror Story, one of the ways in which they really got this story quite accurate is they used a house that looked more like the original one. We won't claim too many accuracies on the part of that depiction, but that is one way in which they did not use this house, they used another one around the corner.
And when they move in, she is supposed to have hosted some elaborate parties that the city, sort of my understanding, fought over to get invites into these parties, that everything that you could possibly want at a party, she had the best of it. And as people started to attend these parties, they were supposed to be noticing something odd, which is that you never saw the same enslaved African twice. And honestly, even for a building this large, which is 3 stories, you really would have only had maximum about 7 enslaved Africans here. But her house was not that large. So you're probably dropping the number down a little bit lower. So never to see the same enslaved African twice was a red flag. And if you asked her about it, then she said, well, you know, we like to send them down to the plantation for fresh air and sunlight. And if you made the mistake of asking her why they never came back, she just uninvited you to the next party. And if you wanted to keep going to the party, then it benefited you to keep your mouth shut. So a fire breaks out in the building to the rear of the house. And that would have been where the enslaved Africans were kept, but it also would have been where the kitchen was located. And so Delphine is less concerned about any potential people inside of that building burning to death and more concerned about the fire reaching the main house. So she starts having her guests take out her furniture, her arts. Yeah, mid-party. The band probably struck up a lively tune in the intersection, and she's just going to keep rolling with the party, moved outdoors while they waited for the fire brigade to arrive. And then when the fire brigade arrived, what they discovered was an elderly enslaved African woman chained to the hearth. And when they put the fire out and revived her, she confessed to having started the blaze. And they couldn't understand why in God's name she would do that, knowing she would be the first to burn. And she said that it was preferable to spending one more night inside of the house. And she directed their attention upstairs to a locked door and said if they were to go into that door, they would understand the secrets that she was, you know, that were supposed to be hidden inside of this house. And so they broke the door down.
And here, the story branches in a bunch of directions, depending on who you ask. So, in keeping with the newspapers from the time and so on, what's your understanding of what was found?
So, I mean, I think honestly, this is the moment that not only does American Horror Story go off the rails, but it's also the moment where a lot of guides go off the rails.
Sure.
And I think it's not really tour guides' fault. I think what has happened over the years is that we felt like we needed to compete with movies like Saw in order to hold people's attention. So we've gotten weirder and grosser and more over the top with the depictions of what went on inside of that room. So we say things like there were sexual experimentation occurring, sex changes being performed On the enslaved, we talk about the crab girl who was in a 3 by 3 by 3 foot cage. And that when they let her out, she had her arms and legs broken and reset at such odd angles that all she could do was crawl upon the floor on her back like a crab, which if you just pause to consider that is so anatomically incorrect, then it actually couldn't have happened.
An AHS has, American Horror Story has her turning one of the people into a minotaur. Like it's a real panoply of things, which when you look at it, comparing the stories that are told on this street and on that TV show to the reality, like we set up this as a horror story about Delphine LaLaurie's sadistic imagination, but when you compare that with the sadistic imaginations of any tour guide walking these streets, or Ryan Murphy for that matter,
right,
she pales in comparison.
Yeah.
So what's your understanding of what they actually saw there?
So we don't really know a lot. What we know was reported in a local newspaper called the New Orleans Bee. And it's
kind of a
not,
gossip rag.
It was totally a gossip rag. And we don't even get a first-hand account. They're not interviewing the fire brigade who went in and saw it. It's third and fourth-hand accounts of supposedly what the fire brigade discovered inside of that room. Mm-hmm. So what we think they discovered inside of that room, given the fact that it's a gossip rag writing about it and you have third and fourth-hand accounts, was that they discovered several enslaved Africans still alive but barely clinging to life. And they also discovered several others that were dead and in the corners of the room in various states of decay. The ones that were still alive, I believe, were manacled about their necks, kind of hanging so that their feet barely touched the floor. There were manacles. The manacles had spikes in them, which made it difficult that they dozed off. It would kind of drive those spikes into them. They had definitely been beaten. They were dehydrated. They were exhausted. One enslaved African had a hole in his head from which maggots could be seen. And we think that that's probably the only thing that kept him alive, if that is in fact true, since maggots eat necrotic flesh. And that's what the New Orleans Bee reported on. But we're never, ever really going to know what went on inside of that room, because that's the only thing we have of what was found in that room.
Pausing briefly with that image in mind, I mean, zooming out, obviously, like, that's the horror of the story, is the idea that a human being could do this to another human being. In your perspective, because I know this is a deep field of knowledge for you, how does that compare with the treatment of enslaved people at large?
So I think there's a myth here in New Orleans that because we had things like the Code Noir, which basically was the French black code, and it provided somewhat for the treatment of enslaved Africans. And then later you have the Conejo Negro, which was the same thing, but the Spanish version. That the myth is that enslaved Africans were maybe treated just fine here.
Yeah.
That it really wasn't that bad to be enslaved.
Because there were rules.
In New Orleans. But then you start to break things down. Like, I think one way of looking at it is just to see what would happen to an enslaved African if they ran away. Mm-hmm. So if you ran away and you got caught running away, the very first time they found you, they branded you with a hot iron, the symbol of New Orleans, which is the fleur-de-lis.
So think about that. If you see somebody with a fleur-de-lis tattoo, that has meaning. Right.
Why? I mean, why? White people don't get a tattoo of the fleur-de-lis, for God's sake. But yeah, so that's one thing they would do. If you ran away a second time and they caught you, it was 30 lashes carried out over the span of 3 days. And think about the sadism that's involved in that, because it's 10 lashes and you have all night while it starts to scab over and to think about what's coming the next day. And then they cut your back open again. And then you go through that whole thing the next night, and then the third day they do it again.
Is it your sense that we have any clear idea of like who? I guess the big question is what happened to everybody afterwards. You have her, you have Louis LaLaurie, her husband, and you have the enslaved people. Like, what's the fate of them? So
we don't really know the fate of the enslaved Africans that were taken out of the home that day. We don't know what happened to them. Delphine and her children and Dr. LaLaurie did escape Louisiana. They made it all the way to New York City. From New York City, they took passage on a boat to France. When they arrived in France, Dr. Louis LaLaurie would leave her, and he would spend the rest of his life in Cuba. He's actually buried in a Havana Cemetery. And my understanding is that she spent the rest of her life just living in the lap of luxury in France. There's some talk that upon her death, her family brought her body back and that she might be secretly interred within St. Louis Cemetery number 1. I don't really buy into that. I think it just sounds like a conspiracy theory, and really more of a conspiracy theory to say that her body would have to come back in order to still be haunting this place.
Sure, more of a ghost story interpretation. I mean, either way, nothing we can call poetic justice by the end. By any means.
Not at all.
Well, that having been the heaviest and toughest and the most complicated, for sure, of the stories that we have here, we're going to move on to something that you might know from American Horror Stories still, but it's a less famous story and one that I think has a lighthearted twist to it, kind of, even if there is some blood and guts involved. So, next up, we're going to head a little bit along Royal Street and get into the story of the Axman.
The next story deals with a serial killer in New Orleans by the name of the Axman. And he seemed to have been targeting Italian grocery store owners. And the reason that we're stopped here is because the building across the way with the beautiful red door, at one point in time on the ground floor was an Italian grocery store, and the family lived up top. And one of the murders by the Axman took place here. So the Axman had a pretty similar MO every single time he broke into someone's house and killed someone. So it was a tiny wooden panel out of the back door that had been chiseled out. And then that's how he gained access into the home. And then he bludgeoned the people inside of the home to death with an axe. You could always see his bloody footprints leading away from the gruesome scene to where he left via that back door. And he would always leave the back door unlocked and the axe there.
That's right, he used their own axes.
Yes.
That's the particularly horrifying part of it. You come to a scene unarmed, just knowing that you're going to find something, and somehow you manage to have a consistent weapon every time you show up.
And then he would leave it. So this kept going on and on and on. And the very first time that he did it, it was uptown. The very first murder that occurred was uptown. And there was a weird thing that he left around the corner from the murder. It said something about Mrs. Tony will sit up tonight, just ask, and it was another name. And the police were kind of perplexed by that. They really didn't understand what that was supposed to mean. And that would be the first of his sort of messages that he would send to the police eventually. But as he killed more and more, the city of New Orleans started to become terrorized, especially the Italian community started to become terrorized. People claimed that they saw him everywhere. Other people claimed that they had obviously had interrupted him, or something had interrupted him because they could see where someone had tried to chisel out the panel and then for whatever reason had stopped and not come into the home. So the city was in a state of panic. And it was during this moment where everybody was about to lose their mind that he decided to write a letter into the police department. And God bless the crazies, because this letter is beautiful. It's beautiful. So he begins by saying, because, people were wondering if this was a demon. Like, that's where New Orleanians were going. That this might not just be a human person that was killing them, but that it might actually be like a devil, the work of the devil. So he begins by saying, "Greetings, humans." Lovely way to start. "I am from the hottest regions of hell. I sit on the right side of Satan at his throne." And he just starts building this. He's like, "I can go and come as I please, and your silly police force can do nothing to stop me."
Which, up till that point, was true.
Absolutely. And he's like, "So on this particular night, I am going to pass over the city of New Orleans like the angel of death." And so he's just building. I mean, if this were like a horror movie, you would hear the music starting to rise right before someone gets decapitated in the frantic scene that's about to follow. And you can just feel the tension in the letter rising. And then he gets to this point where he says, "I am very fond of jazz music." Wait, what? It's like demon, hell, fire, murder, horror. I like jazz music.
And to be fair, very disreputable, very other side of the moral tracks music at the time. So if there was a taste for the devil in popular conception to be had at the time, it stacks up with the archetype.
Absolutely.
So there's a call to action involved.
Absolutely. So what he goes on to say is that on this night, as he passes over the city like the angel of death, he will spare people's lives if they're playing jazz music, if they, according to his phrase, jazz it up.
And this is like not a small request, because we're talking like before the availability of much recorded jazz.
Absolutely.
So you needed a live band.
Absolutely.
Or you needed to play your own piano. Like one of those two things. You had to be producing jazz, not just putting a record on. Like this was asking a lot.
So of course, though, this letter gets reproduced in the papers, and the city of New Orleans is frantic. So on this particular night, they did indeed jazz it up. I mean, people went to each other's houses to have big jazz parties where they had come together to purchase, to be able to pay for the band, or they went out to nightclubs, or they went out to bars, anything that they could possibly do to be surrounded by jazz music. And as a matter of fact, there's a song written for the occasion called the Axman's Jazz.
Again, somebody making money off of
Yeah,
these
absolutely.
things, inevitably.
And you can pull it up online, the Axman's Jazz.
It's catchy. It's like a nice little tune.
Yeah, it's a lovely little rag, basically.
And the question of like, okay, a lot of money goes into, well, okay, let's come back to that second. What happens that night?
So on that particular night, nobody died.
There we go.
So apparently
So it
he
worked.
was satisfied as he passed over the city of New Orleans that everyone was indeed jazzing it up. And
Which suggests that the letter writer either was legit or like knew that there wouldn't possibly be an attack that night anyway.
right.
So whoever wrote that letter, it like kind of
Knew
adds
something.
legitimacy to it.
Absolutely. But then it would be several weeks to several months, I believe, before another murder took place.
Uh-huh.
And then the murders started up again. And then as abruptly as they started, they abruptly stopped. And we don't have a reason why. He was never caught. He was never prosecuted. We have no idea who the Axman was. So we're not sure if he was arrested on another crime and then was jailed, and that's why the murder stopped, or if he died or perhaps moved away and began to kill somewhere else, and there's never been a link.
Some home vigilantism, something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, and people speculate about identity or about motive based on the letter and about the tying in of music into all this. And people often propose, I guess, forgive me for a pun, but that this was somebody who had an axe to grind and like wanted to boost the music industry in some way.
Right.
With the convenient parallel that axe was slang for a saxophone as well. And that's another thing that American Horror Story took full advantage of. So in the speculation sphere, like, this is a fun fan theory, basically.
And honestly, the best sort of theory that I've heard too has to do with the fact that, most people are unaware that New Orleans was the second largest port of immigration.
Sure.
So if you were second outside of New York City, obviously, and if you were coming from Italy and you were coming from the northern regions of Italy, you typically went to New York because the climate would have suited you. But if you were coming from the southern regions, you came here because the climate would have suited you. And what existed in southern Italy at the time was something called the Black Hand, which most historians are in agreement that was the forerunner of the United States Mafia. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people speculate that this might have been mafia hits, and that the reason the killing stopped is because he had killed the people that he was supposed to kill, that he had been paid to kill, and then that was the end of it. And that maybe in the meantime, he just had some fun with the police with the letter, if he's indeed the one that wrote the letter.
And that's a big piece of French Quarter history that a lot of people visiting don't notice, is like, this was Little Palermo. This was like Sicilian Central, and 80% population at peak in the first couple decades of the 20th century. Yeah. So if such a thing was going to happen, this is where it would have happened. Nowadays, if you're going to get mafia hits on Italian families, it'd be in the peaceful suburbs of Metairie, and no tourist would ever hear about it.
It's true.
I'm sure there have been some fascinating serial killings out there since then.
Right.
So it's also noteworthy, like, this story is often included in ghost tours, but it's not actually a ghost story in and of itself. It's got this kind of satanic, supernatural overtone to it. And if one takes the letter literally, then there is some supernaturalness maybe involved. But it's telling, too, that when you take a ghost tour, I mean, sometimes you're going to hear voodoo stories and vampire stories, sometimes at this very house.
Absolutely.
And crime stories and just violent stories. It's a huge genre with lots of very close neighbors.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of the reason for that is because you can't guarantee that someone's going to see a ghost. I mean, if you could, we would all be retired by now.
That's right. This would be a much more, this would be a 401k kind of industry.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if ghosts wanted to be seen, like, they would definitely know that they could get plenty of attention here. Whereas if ghosts didn't want to be seen, they might roam a little wide of the French Quarter and tuck themselves into more innocuous spots. Something to think about. Well, y'all, now that the night has passed completely, the sun has risen, and a new day has begun, we have told you 8 hours worth of ghost stories. And, oh, no? You didn't hear 8 hours worth of ghost stories? Go search the video more closely. Thank you, Sandy, for this time.
Thank you.
Very good of you. And y'all, again, if you appreciate what Sandy's done for us this evening, please go look down for that tip information down below. Keep this operation going. And for the rest of it, y'all, please drop us a like. We know you've been looking for this for a while. We hope it's what you wanted. If not, let us know why. We'd love to hear all the details down in the comments. Subscribe, hit the bell, so you'll hear next time we do something else. Thanks so much for your time this time around, y'all. See you next time soon.
Thank you.